The sprawling, cavernous metropolitan transit station echoed with the chaotic, relentless cacophony of the evening rush hour. Outside, a torrential downpour battered the city, dragging freezing water and thick mud onto the highly polished, dangerously slick-tiled floors of the main concourse. The visual contrast within this subterranean cavern was immediate and incredibly stark. Hundreds of hurried, able-bodied commuters rushed past in a continuous, unyielding blur, their heads buried deeply in their expensive smartphones as they marched toward their warm homes. They moved like a fierce, relentless river actively flowing around a single, entirely stationary obstacle completely ignored by the masses. Trapped at the treacherous top edge of a steeply angled, permanently broken accessibility ramp sat a solitary man in a battered wheelchair, completely swallowed by the deafening apathy of a modern metropolis that simply refused to acknowledge his quiet, desperate existence. Marcus Hayes, a 35-year-old former warehouse worker, sat perfectly still in his worn, standard manual wheelchair, projecting an aura of immense patience and quiet dignity. 3 years ago, a catastrophic, life-altering industrial accident had permanently severed his spine, leaving his legs completely paralyzed and visibly atrophied beneath his faded denim jeans. His incredibly strong, heavily calloused hands gripped the cold metal rims of his chair, trembling slightly from the sheer, agonizing exhaustion of a grueling, 3-hour physical therapy session. The massive transit station's only operational elevator had been inexplicably out of service for weeks, leaving him stranded on the elevated platform. Marcus was quietly, desperately trying to map out a safe, alternate route home through the treacherous rain, doing everything in his limited power to swallow his daily pride and absolutely avoid being an inconvenience to the rushing, indifferent crowds swarming around him. Observing this stagnant disruption in the heavy commuter flow was Officer Jason J. Miller, a 23-year-old rookie transit cop who was desperately, aggressively trying to project absolute authority. Miller wore a flawlessly crisp, heavily starched dark blue uniform, black tactical gloves, and an aggressively tight, severe buzz cut that framed a face twisted in a perpetual sneer. He walked across the slick, wet tiles with an exaggerated, incredibly arrogant swagger, his right hand constantly, nervously resting dangerously near his heavy utility belt. Deeply insecure about his profound lack of genuine law enforcement experience, the young rookie dangerously equated civilian fear with professional respect. He aggressively overcompensated for his profound internal cowardice by treating every single minor public inconvenience or basic civilian question as a direct, hostile threat to his fragile ego and his newly acquired, completely unchecked badge of absolute city authority. Miller spotted the stationary wheelchair positioned near the broken ramp and immediately, irrationally decided the paralyzed man was maliciously loitering to intentionally disrupt the critical flow of evening traffic. Marching aggressively through the parting sea of wet, hurried commuters, the rookie officer stopped directly in front of the exhausted former warehouse worker with a deeply hostile glare. "Hey buddy, you cannot block this pedestrian walkway during rush hour. Move along right now," Miller barked, his voice echoing loudly and aggressively over the station's ambient noise. Marcus looked up, his expression remaining entirely calm and exceptionally polite despite the harsh, entirely unwarranted hostility. "Good evening, officer. I apologize, but the main elevator is currently broken. Could you please point me toward the nearest accessible exit?" Marcus asked softly, genuinely hoping the uniformed public servant would offer some basic, much-needed navigational assistance. The completely reasonable, highly respectful request instantly infuriated the insecure rookie, who automatically assumed the disabled man was being intentionally defiant and blatantly disrespectful. Miller aggressively stepped closer, his heavy black boots splashing loudly in a puddle of dirty rainwater, looming threateningly over the seated, exhausted man. "I'm not a damn tour guide, and I am not asking you again. Stand up, walk over to those stairs, and exit this facility immediately," Miller ordered, his tone dripping with toxic, condescending arrogance. Marcus did not raise his voice or exhibit any anger. He simply looked the aggressive officer directly in the eye. "I cannot do that, officer. I am completely paralyzed from the waist down," Marcus replied with quiet, unshakable dignity. Miller's fragile ego violently flared, immediately accusing the vulnerable citizen of blatantly lying simply to avoid receiving a loitering citation. In a sudden, incredibly shocking display of absolutely unnecessary, horrific physical force, the young rookie decided to aggressively demonstrate his unquestionable municipal authority. Ignoring basic human decency and every single protocol he had ever been taught, Miller swiftly stepped behind the seated man and violently grabbed the rubber back handles of the battered wheelchair. With a vicious, adrenaline-fueled heave, the arrogant officer aggressively tipped the heavy metal chair entirely forward. Marcus was violently dumped out of his seat, crashing heavily onto the exceptionally hard, dangerously wet tile floor in front of dozens of completely horrified, suddenly frozen evening commuters. The heavy wheelchair clattered loudly beside him, a twisted monument to the rookie's staggering, unchecked cruelty. The deafening, chaotic noise of the transit station instantly evaporated, replaced by an incredibly heavy, suffocating silence of collective shock and absolute, profound civic horror. Are you liking this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, we continue with the video. The horrific, agonizing descent felt as though it occurred in a vacuum of suffocating, terrifying slow motion. Marcus hit the incredibly hard, dangerously slick tiled floor with a sickening, resounding impact that echoed violently across the frozen transit station. The heavy, battered wheelchair clattered aggressively onto the wet concrete beside him, its spinning wheels a mocking testament to the sudden, entirely unprovoked brutality. His completely useless, heavily atrophied legs twisted awkwardly underneath his torso, tangling in a deeply unnatural, agonizing position that immediately highlighted his profound physical vulnerability. The freezing rainwater and filthy station mud instantly soaked through his faded denim jeans, chilling him to the bone as the initial shock washed over his exhausted body. He was completely defenseless, violently stripped of his hard-earned mobility and thrown onto the unforgiving ground by the very municipal authority sworn to protect him from such harm. Despite the sudden, terrifying violence inflicted upon his vulnerable frame, Marcus did not yell in furious anger or scream for violent retribution. The agonizing physical pain immediately radiated from his right wrist, which had instinctively snapped outward to bear the crushing, sudden weight of his entire falling body. However, the sharp, blinding physical agony of the impact was entirely eclipsed by the suffocating, profound emotional humiliation of being publicly discarded like useless trash. He lay on the cold, filthy, wet tiles, completely surrounded by a massive sea of horrified evening commuters, his shattered dignity painfully exposed for the entire city to witness. The brutal, unforgiving reality of his deeply fragile existence crashed over him, a harsh, undeniable reminder that all his grueling daily efforts to simply survive could be instantly, violently erased by one arrogant, deeply insecure man wearing a pristine uniform. Operating entirely on raw, desperate survival instinct honed through years of agonizing struggle, Marcus immediately attempted to protect his shattered, vulnerable body. He used his incredibly strong, heavily calloused hands to aggressively drag his paralyzed, useless torso backward across the slick, filthy tiles, instinctively trying to put distance between himself and the aggressive rookie. Every single agonizing backward scrape across the wet concrete was a heartbreaking, physically exhausting testament to his profound resilience and his terrifying, immediate fear of further police assault. He did not reach out to strike the towering armed officer. He simply dragged his broken form away like a wounded animal desperately seeking shelter from a relentless, unprovoked predator. The sheer, heartbreaking indignity of dragging his own paralyzed legs across a dirty transit station floor was a deeply traumatic, unforgettable visual that permanently seared itself into the collective memory. This profound, agonizing public humiliation violently resurrected the deeply traumatic ghosts of his incredibly painful past. Exactly 3 years ago, Marcus had been a strong, capable warehouse worker before a catastrophic industrial accident crushed his spine beneath thousands of pounds of unyielding steel. He had spent months lying completely immobilized in a sterile hospital bed, aggressively fighting through suffocating depression and the terrifying permanent loss of his independence. Just hours before this horrific transit assault, he had successfully completed a grueling 3-hour physical therapy session, desperately pushing his heavily scarred body to its absolute physical limits. He had successfully fought his way back from the absolute brink of death, only to be violently, casually thrown onto a dirty, wet tile floor by an incredibly arrogant rookie who fundamentally possessed absolutely no understanding of true suffering, sacrifice, or genuine human resilience. Marcus had diligently, painstakingly learned how to completely swallow his deep, personal pride on a daily basis, just to navigate a modern world that was fundamentally not built for him. He had bravely adapted to broken accessibility ramps, narrow public doorways, and the constant, deeply exhausting logistical challenges of moving through a massive, indifferent metropolitan landscape in a standard wheelchair. He had quietly, gracefully accepted the frequent pitying stares of passing strangers, always choosing immense patience over justified anger. But this brutal, entirely unprovoked public assault was completely different. It was an aggressive, intentional violation of his basic human dignity and his fundamental civil rights. The quiet, peaceful man who had bravely learned to adapt to incredible adversity was now being violently, unfairly punished, simply for existing in a heavily flawed, broken municipal environment that constantly challenged his right to basic, safe public mobility. The heavy, suffocating silence that immediately followed the horrific crash abruptly shattered the deeply ingrained, collective apathy of the massive rush-hour crowd. The relentless, hurried river of hundreds of focused, smartphone-obsessed commuters came to a sudden, incredibly jarring halt as the horrifying reality of the brutal police assault finally registered. People completely froze in their tracks, their expensive briefcases and heavy shopping bags dropping carelessly onto the slick, wet tiles as they stared in absolute, profound disbelief at the fallen, disabled man. The typical, cold metropolitan indifference instantly evaporated, rapidly replaced by a surging, collective wave of intense, undeniable civic horror and deep moral outrage. The invisible, comfortable societal barrier between the rushing, able-bodied public and the invisible, marginalized citizen was violently, permanently destroyed by the rookie officer's staggering, unchecked cruelty, instantly awakening the dormant conscience of the entire transit station. Breaking through the frozen, horrified sea of stagnant commuters was a remarkably brave off-duty emergency room nurse who had witnessed the entire unprovoked assault. She immediately dropped her heavy groceries onto the filthy, wet floor without a single second of hesitation, aggressively rushing forward through the thick, parted crowd to intervene. Her deeply ingrained medical instincts and profound human empathy completely overrode any rational fear of the heavily armed, aggressively posturing transit police officer standing nearby. She slid desperately onto her knees across the treacherous, slick tiles, immediately placing her own fragile civilian body directly between the aggressive, towering rookie and the deeply traumatized, paralyzed man. She gently, professionally placed her warm hands on Marcus's trembling shoulders, offering immediate, critical physical protection and a profound, beautiful display of genuine human compassion in the darkest, most terrifying moment of his entire life. The brave, incredibly selfless off-duty nurse looked directly up at the towering, heavily armed rookie officer, her face contorted with absolute, unadulterated righteous fury. "He is completely paralyzed, you absolute, pathetic coward!" she screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, her incredibly powerful voice echoing violently across the cavernous, vaulted transit station. The devastating, undeniable truth of Marcus's profound physical vulnerability hit the silent, frozen crowd like a massive, explosive shockwave, instantly transforming their quiet horror into an incredibly aggressive, protective fury. She aggressively shielded Marcus with her own small frame, fiercely daring the terrified, incompetent rookie to use his violent, unchecked municipal force against a civilian medical professional protecting a highly disabled victim. Her loud, incredibly courageous scream successfully broke the hypnotic spell of police authority, actively empowering the surrounding crowd to finally step forward and take decisive, protective action. Responding immediately to the brave nurse's incredibly powerful, furious declaration, the surrounding metropolitan crowd aggressively mobilized into a formidable, defensive formation. Multiple hurried commuters, ranging from highly paid corporate executives to exhausted blue-collar workers, instantly stepped completely forward to form a thick, impenetrable human wall. They aggressively positioned their own bodies directly between the fallen, disabled man and the increasingly panicked, heavily armed rookie officer, creating an absolute physical barrier of collective civic resistance. The people who had previously ignored Marcus completely now actively risked their own personal safety to aggressively defend his shattered dignity and basic human rights. It was a profound, incredibly beautiful moment of spontaneous, raw human connection. A massive, unified rejection of the cruel, unchecked municipal authority that had violently attempted to terrorize one of the city's most vulnerable, completely defenseless, and entirely innocent, disabled citizens. As the thick, protective human wall rapidly solidified around Marcus, a massive, terrifying sea of glowing smartphones aggressively emerged from the dense, angry crowd. Dozens of highly focused, unblinking camera lenses were instantly pointed directly at Officer Miller, capturing his pale, terrified face and the brutal, undeniable aftermath of his incredibly horrific actions. The commuters silently, aggressively documented every single agonizing detail. The overturned, battered manual wheelchair, the frightened off-duty nurse, and the paralyzed man dragging his broken body across the filthy, wet tiles. The immense, undeniable power of immediate, high-definition digital documentation completely stripped away any possibility of a standard police cover-up. Miller was no longer safely operating in the comfortable, isolated shadows of a localized transit station. He was now violently exposed on a massive, unforgiving global stage, entirely surrounded by dozens of hostile, aggressively recording civilian witnesses. Standing completely alone against the massive, angry, and rapidly expanding human wall, Officer Miller's aggressive, tough guy facade completely, instantaneously collapsed into pure, unadulterated panic. The vibrant, arrogant color violently drained from his youthful face, leaving him looking incredibly pale, deeply sick, and profoundly terrified of the massive crowd surrounding him. He physically staggered backward, his right hand nervously dropping away from his heavy utility belt as he finally, terribly realized the staggering, catastrophic magnitude of his incredibly foolish actions. He deeply understood, with a sudden, suffocating clarity, that his shiny silver badge and his crisp, dark blue uniform could never possibly protect him from the sheer monstrosity of violently assaulting a paralyzed citizen. The deeply insecure, aggressive bully was finally, permanently unmasked, publicly revealed to the entire city, as nothing more than a frightened, incredibly incompetent boy, playing a dangerous, violent game. The terrifying internal realization of his own profound cowardice aggressively suffocated Miller, as he stared at the dozens of unblinking camera lenses recording his absolute ruin. His entirely fabricated, heavily projected aura of absolute municipal authority had completely shattered, instantly replaced by a deep, incredibly primal terror of incoming, massive legal accountability. He had desperately sought civilian fear to validate his own deep insecurities, but looking at the furious, protective crowd, he realized they did not fear him. They absolutely, profoundly despised him. He lacked the basic, fundamental courage to apologize or immediately assist the disabled man he had so violently harmed, choosing instead to desperately formulate a pathetic, defensive escape plan. His internal conflict was entirely rooted in selfish preservation, totally, completely devoid of any genuine moral remorse for the horrific, traumatic damage he had just inflicted upon a completely innocent man. Frantically retreating from the furious recording crowd, Miller completely fled the subterranean transit station and aggressively rushed back to the isolated safety of his local precinct. Sitting alone in a cramped, dimly lit office, his trembling, heavily sweating hands desperately hovered over his computer keyboard as he prepared to commit a massive felony. Driven entirely by absolute, blinding panic and a pathetic, selfish desire to save his incredibly short law enforcement career, the terrified rookie aggressively initiated a highly falsified police report. He was desperately attempting to aggressively rewrite the brutal, undeniable reality of the public incident, completely ignoring the massive, irrefutable digital evidence that was already rapidly spreading across the internet. He foolishly believed that his official, sworn municipal narrative could successfully overpower the collective, documented truth of dozens of angry, deeply traumatized civilian witnesses who had fiercely protected the victim. In his heavily falsified, incredibly desperate official report, Miller explicitly, maliciously claimed that the disabled suspect had intentionally reached aggressively for his heavy duty belt. He wove a pathetic, highly detailed web of absolute deceit, falsely stating that Marcus had become extremely combative and highly resistant, absolutely necessitating the immediate use of physical force. By legally categorizing the paralyzed man as a highly dangerous, violent threat to his personal safety, Miller was aggressively attempting to completely justify his unprovoked, horrific battery. It was a cold, incredibly calculating betrayal of his sworn civic oath, a massive, corrupt abuse of municipal power designed solely to violently crush an innocent victim to protect a guilty, deeply incompetent officer. Miller signed the fraudulent document with a shaking hand, unknowingly sealing his own devastating, inescapable federal fate with his arrogant, completely transparent, and deeply malicious lies. While the panicked rookie desperately typed his fraudulent lies, the massive, undeniable external explosion of the horrific incident was already rapidly occurring online. The shocking, highly graphic bystander video of the unprovoked wheelchair assault aggressively went viral completely overnight, rapidly dominating massive social media platforms and national morning news broadcasts. The entire city aggressively woke up to the deeply disturbing, high-definition footage of an arrogant, heavily armed police officer violently dumping a completely helpless, paralyzed citizen onto the wet floor. The resulting civic outrage was absolutely immediate, overwhelmingly massive, and incredibly furious, sparking massive, peaceful protests directly outside the Metropolitan Transit Authority's main municipal headquarters. The undeniable, brutal visual evidence completely bypassed traditional, slow, municipal channels, instantly transforming the quiet, deeply patient Marcus into a massive, highly visible national symbol of extreme police brutality and gross systemic discrimination against the disabled community. While the entire city furiously demanded immediate, absolute justice, Marcus lay in a sterile, brightly lit hospital bed, confronting a completely devastating, highly agonizing new reality. The aggressive, unprovoked fall had successfully resulted in a severe, incredibly painful fractured right wrist, a deeply catastrophic medical diagnosis for a man completely dependent on his arms. His heavily calloused hands and strong arms were his only independent, viable means of pushing his heavy manual wheelchair and successfully navigating his incredibly difficult, barrier-filled world. This severe, totally unnecessary injury aggressively jeopardized his hard-earned physical independence, threatening to violently push him back into the dark, suffocating depths of profound depression he had previously conquered. The physical, agonizing pain of the severe fracture was incredibly intense, but the terrifying, deeply profound psychological terror of losing his basic, hard-won mobility was an absolutely crushing, unbearable mental burden. As the massive public pressure rapidly intensified, the powerful local police union aggressively mobilized to completely shield Officer Miller from any immediate public accountability or discipline. They aggressively circled their organizational wagons, issuing highly defensive, incredibly tone-deaf press releases attempting to aggressively protect the young, incredibly reckless rookie from the massive public fallout. The union forcefully argued that the public should strictly reserve judgment, aggressively citing the incredibly challenging, high-stress environment of metropolitan transit policing and split-second defensive decisions. Their deeply defensive, highly aggressive posture actively worsened the massive public relations nightmare, completely demonstrating a deeply rooted, toxic institutional priority to protect bad officers over innocent, highly vulnerable citizens. They stubbornly refused to completely acknowledge the massive, undeniable video evidence, deeply insulting the collective intelligence of the furious city and actively pouring highly explosive fuel onto the rapidly growing fire of immense public outrage. Recognizing the absolute, catastrophic legal and financial danger of the viral video, the city's cold, highly calculating municipal legal team aggressively stepped directly into the massive conflict. Two highly paid, incredibly aggressive defense attorneys unexpectedly arrived at Marcus's sterile hospital room, completely armed with heavily worded non-disclosure agreements and an offensive, highly insulting settlement strategy. They aggressively attempted to completely bypass his legal representation, utilizing highly intimidating, deeply manipulative legal jargon to pressure the exhausted, heavily medicated disabled man into absolute silence. The aggressive municipal lawyers deeply understood that a massive, highly publicized federal civil rights trial would completely destroy the city's reputation and result in a massive financial judgment. They cold-bloodedly calculated that a poor, newly injured, and deeply exhausted victim would easily crumble under their immense, highly coordinated legal pressure and quickly accept a deeply insulting, incredibly quiet resolution. With incredibly toxic, condescending arrogance, the aggressive city lawyers explicitly offered Marcus a highly pitiful, completely insulting $50,000 in rapid, immediate hush-money settlement funds. They deeply presented the incredibly low financial offer as a generous, highly compassionate municipal gift, strictly demanding that he sign a permanent non-disclosure agreement to completely bury the incident. They were desperately, aggressively trying to make the colossal, highly explosive public relations nightmare completely disappear before it could ever legally reach a federal courtroom and expose the department's deep rot. Marcus looked at the heavily printed, insulting contract, his severely fractured, heavily casted right wrist throbbing with intense, agonizing pain as he slowly realized the sheer magnitude of their profound municipal disrespect. They completely believed his shattered dignity, his stolen mobility, and his horrific public trauma could be cheaply, quietly purchased by a highly corrupt, incredibly terrified municipal system. The heavy oak doors of the federal district courthouse swung open, marking the beginning of a highly anticipated civil rights trial that had completely captured the city's outraged attention. Inside the massive wood-paneled courtroom, the atmosphere was incredibly tense, thick with the heavy, undeniable anticipation of long-delayed municipal justice. Marcus Hayes slowly navigated his battered wheelchair toward the elevated witness stand, his severely fractured right wrist securely bound in a heavy medical cast. He moved with a quiet, unshakable dignity that sharply contrasted the chaotic, media-frenzied circus eagerly waiting just outside the secure federal building. Sitting nervously across the expansive room at the defense table, Officer Jason Miller wore a tailored, expensive suit, his previously arrogant, tough guy facade completely replaced by pale, sweating anxiety. The highly public, incredibly high-stakes legal battle line was finally, officially drawn, pitting arrogant municipal power against deeply resilient human vulnerability. Taking the sworn oath, Marcus began his emotional, highly anticipated testimony with a remarkably calm, incredibly powerful voice that commanded absolute silence throughout the packed federal courtroom. He did not yell or angrily demand violent retribution. He simply spoke the quiet, undeniable truth about his agonizing, daily struggles and the horrific, unprovoked assault that had shattered his hard-earned independence. He meticulously described the sheer, paralyzing terror of hitting the wet transit floor, his profound humiliation, and the agonizing, devastating reality of losing the critical use of his right hand. Every single word he softly delivered landed like a massive, undeniable physical blow against the city's highly funded, deeply corrupt legal defense team. The jury listened with rapt, deeply emotional attention, completely captivated by the raw, undeniable humanity and immense, quiet strength of a man who had been violently treated as worthless trash. Attempting to aggressively salvage their rapidly crumbling case, the highly paid, incredibly aggressive lead defense attorney immediately launched into a vicious, deeply insulting cross-examination of the paralyzed plaintiff. He desperately tried to paint the quiet, dignified Marcus as an inherently uncooperative, highly combative suspect who had intentionally, maliciously defied a direct municipal order. The ruthless municipal lawyer aggressively leaned over the wooden podium, loudly questioning Marcus's exact tone of voice and desperately trying to legally validate Miller's heavily falsified, deeply corrupt police report. He explicitly, repeatedly suggested that Marcus had aggressively reached for the rookie officer's heavy-duty belt, desperately attempting to legally categorize the horrific, unprovoked assault as a highly necessary, split-second defensive tactic. It was a disgusting, deeply manipulative legal strategy designed entirely to aggressively blame the completely defenseless victim for his own horrific, highly publicized, and entirely unjust public brutalization. The absolute, undeniable turning point of the massive federal trial arrived when Marcus's brilliant civil rights attorney finally stepped forward to completely dismantle the city's highly fabricated, corrupt narrative. He did not engage in loud, theatrical shouting matches with the aggressive defense team. Instead, he calmly submitted a previously suppressed, highly explosive piece of digital evidence to the court. The attorney formally introduced the Transit Authority's own high-definition, multi-angle security camera footage, which the local police union had desperately, aggressively attempted to permanently bury and completely hide from public view. The massive courtroom lights were instantly, dramatically dimmed, and a large digital projector illuminated a massive white screen positioned directly in front of the attentive, highly focused jury box. The heavy, suffocating silence in the room became incredibly thick, pregnant with the terrifying, undeniable anticipation of absolute, objective truth finally being aggressively revealed. As the crisp, high-definition transit footage began to silently play, Officer Miller's heavily falsified, deeply corrupt official narrative was instantaneously, violently, and permanently destroyed in front of the entire city. The exceptionally clear, undeniable video completely confirmed that Marcus had been perfectly stationary, incredibly polite, and absolutely non-threatening during the entire brief interaction with the arrogant transit rookie. The entire packed federal courtroom collectively gasped in absolute unfiltered horror as they watched Miller aggressively, violently tip the heavy wheelchair forward without a single shred of physical provocation. The high-resolution video clearly showed Marcus's hands desperately gripping his wheels, entirely contradicting the pathetic, malicious lie that he had aggressively reached for the officer's weapon. The massive, undeniable digital truth was an incredibly bright, purifying light that completely incinerated the toxic, highly corrupt municipal shadows the desperate defense team had so aggressively tried to utilize. Facing the absolute, catastrophic destruction of their deeply fabricated legal defense, the highly paid municipal attorney desperately attempted to deliver a saving final closing statement to the horrified jury. He stumbled over his heavily rehearsed, deeply manipulative words, his aggressive confidence entirely shattered by the brutal, irrefutable reality of the high-definition transit video playing on a continuous damning loop. The attorney desperately pleaded for understanding, attempting to cite the high-stress, incredibly demanding nature of modern metropolitan policing as a pitiful, completely inadequate excuse for the horrific, unprovoked battery. He was aggressively, pathetically grasping at invisible straws, attempting to legally defend the absolutely indefensible actions of a terrified, deeply arrogant bully who had violently abused a paralyzed man. The entire packed federal courtroom watched his deeply embarrassing, highly desperate legal flailing with a collective, heavy sense of profound, unadulterated civic and moral disgust. Suddenly, the presiding federal judge, an incredibly stern woman radiating absolute, undeniable legal disgust, aggressively slammed her heavy wooden gavel down, violently interrupting the defense attorney's pathetic, rambling closing statement. She looked directly down from her elevated wooden bench, locking her furious, piercing eyes onto the incredibly pale, heavily sweating, and completely terrified figure of Officer Jason Miller. You wear a shiny silver badge that historically signifies public protection, yet you violently, aggressively assaulted a completely defenseless man whose only crime was simply existing in a difficult world that already challenges him daily, she declared loudly. Her incredibly powerful, highly resonant voice echoed violently across the silent, packed federal courtroom, carrying the immense, undeniable weight of absolute, uncompromised judicial fury. You are an absolute, profound disgrace to the honorable star pinned to your chest and to this entire metropolitan municipality. Following the judge's deeply profound, incredibly devastating public condemnation, the highly focused, deeply furious federal jury was formally dismissed to deliberate the massive civil rights case. They returned to the silent courtroom in absolute historic record time, their rapid, incredibly decisive consensus loudly signaling a massive, undeniable victory for true, uncompromised municipal justice. The jury foreman stood up and forcefully read the crushing, entirely unanimous federal verdict, instantly finding Officer Miller and the city completely, undeniably liable for extreme civil rights violations and horrific battery. They forcefully ordered a staggering massive $1 million punitive financial payout directly to Marcus Hayes, completely crushing the city's pathetic, insulting initial offer. It was a massive, profoundly emotional validation of Marcus's shattered dignity, a loud, undeniable, and permanent civic declaration that the aggressive abuse of highly vulnerable citizens would never again be tolerated in their proud city. Are you liking this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. Despite the massive, unprecedented $1 million punitive payout, Marcus Hayes absolutely refused to simply take the settlement money and quietly hide from the public eye. He viewed the staggering financial victory not as a personal lottery ticket, but as an incredibly powerful, uncompromising weapon to completely dismantle the deeply entrenched systemic apathy that had facilitated his horrific assault. He immediately utilized a massive portion of his newfound wealth to launch an aggressive, highly publicized civil lawsuit directly against the city's corrupt transit authority. Through relentless legal pressure, Marcus successfully forced a strict, unyielding federal mandate requiring the immediate repair, extensive modernization, and daily maintenance of every single broken elevator and accessibility ramp across the entire sprawling metropolitan district, permanently ensuring safe public transit for all disabled citizens. Extending his profound pursuit of justice far beyond the transit system, Marcus quickly established a highly funded, deeply impactful philanthropic foundation dedicated exclusively to empowering the city's most vulnerable residents. His groundbreaking nonprofit organization focused on purchasing and distributing state-of-the-art, incredibly expensive motorized wheelchairs completely free of charge to low-income paralyzed individuals who had been previously abandoned by the deeply broken healthcare system. By brilliantly transforming his own horrific, deeply traumatizing public humiliation into a massive engine for incredible civic good, he ensured that countless disabled citizens would immediately regain their hard-earned physical independence. Marcus aggressively guaranteed that absolutely no one in his community would ever again be forced to violently drag their broken bodies across a filthy, unforgiving tile floor simply to survive their daily commute. The devastating, undeniable consequences for the arrogant rookie officer were absolutely absolute and profoundly severe, completely destroying his fabricated law enforcement career. Jason Miller was immediately and unceremoniously fired from the Metropolitan Transit Force, permanently stripped of his municipal police certification, and aggressively prosecuted on highly serious, inescapable felony battery charges for his unprovoked, horrific assault. Furthermore, facing immense, unrelenting public pressure and federal oversight, the disgraced local police department was legally forced to instantly institute mandatory, highly rigorous ADA compliance programs. They implemented severe, uncompromising de-escalation training for every single active duty officer, permanently altering the toxic, heavily militarized culture that had previously allowed deeply insecure, aggressive bullies to violently terrorize the city's innocent, marginalized populations without any fear of facing genuine, serious professional repercussions. Exactly 2 years after that terrifying, deeply agonizing evening, Marcus Hayes smoothly glided into a beautifully renovated, incredibly bright metropolitan transit station. He navigated the bustling, crowded public space with absolute unhindered freedom, comfortably seated in a sleek, state-of-the-art motorized wheelchair directly provided by his own highly successful philanthropic foundation. The previously broken, highly treacherous accessibility ramps and isolated elevators were now absolutely pristine, heavily modernized, and perfectly maintained by the city. They stood as a permanent, highly functional, and beautiful monument to his profound personal resilience and his relentless, uncompromising legal battle against deep-seated municipal apathy. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that had once entirely defined his daily, exhausting public commute was completely gone, replaced by a profound, undeniable sense of absolute safety and deeply respected civic belonging. As Marcus effortlessly rolled across the incredibly clean, completely dry tiled floor of the main concourse, he quietly observed a group of young, highly attentive police academy cadets conducting their evening foot patrols. Instead of projecting an aura of arrogant, aggressive hostility or aggressively intimidating passing commuters, one of the crisp, newly trained cadets respectfully paused his active patrol. With a warm, genuine smile, the young officer kindly held a heavy, reinforced station door completely open for an elderly, struggling woman carrying heavy groceries. Marcus offered a quiet, deeply satisfied smile from his modern wheelchair, profoundly knowing that his agonizing, horrific public humiliation had successfully brought a permanent, systemic cultural change. The city's sworn protectors had finally, truly learned how to genuinely serve their highly diverse, incredibly vulnerable community. The overarching, deeply emotional narrative of the paralyzed warehouse worker and the deeply arrogant rookie concludes with an undeniable, incredibly resonant moral truth that echoes across the entire city. Municipal authority that operates completely devoid of genuine human empathy is nothing more than absolute, unchecked public cruelty disguised by a shiny silver badge. True, Lasting societal justice does not merely compensate the broken individual victim and quietly sweep the horrific incident under the bureaucratic rug. It aggressively, unapologetically rebuilds the entire broken system so that absolutely no one else ever has to fall. The devastating, undeniable cost of arrogant power was ultimately completely eclipsed by the absolute, fierce protection of the vulnerable, proving that true community strength is always measured by how fiercely a society defends its most marginalized, defenseless citizens. Have they made any gesture of kindness that changed a life? Leave a little heart if you believe that love is more powerful than any wealth. Subscribe for more second chance stories. Comment "Love is priceless" if you also believe in human union.